I was a loyal dietitian to the good old food pyramid and the food nutrition guidelines, and it was healthy whole grains, low fat. I mean, the whole thing. It really started from a couple of conversations that I had with my colleagues, and we had a PhD student who was looking at hyperinsulinemia, and I was brought on board as a secondary supervisor for this PhD student. And then he said, "So dietary management of type 2 diabetes is what?" I said, "Well, healthy whole grains, 45 to 60% of your diet is carbohydrates and blah, blah, blah." And he asked a very, very simple question. And he said, what is the reason why we manage a condition of insulin resistance with the very thing that our bodies struggle to process under the conditions of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia? And it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. No one had really asked me that before. And that kind of prompted me to do a really deep dive into the literature and revisiting some of the rationale for low carb and some of the physiology, biochemistry around it. And it just kind of blew me away. In fact, there was a time there, probably for about 3 or 4 months, that I thought, what am I going to do with this information? It's that whole cliche of once you see something, you can't unsee it. And I was in a real quandary. What do I do with my career? I think I actually need to get out of this because I just don't know how to handle this. Yeah, hi.
Well, welcome. And I guess I said kia ora, I suppose, perhaps.
Oh, excellent. Nice.
Yeah,
Love it.
I don't know if you knew this, but I used to live in New Zealand. I lived in...
I didn't
Yeah,
No, I didn't know that.
I came there.
Where did you live?
I live in Cambridge, which is near Hamilton in the Waikato. I was there to play rugby. So
actually, you know what? That rings a bell. I think I've heard that somewhere. You've mentioned it to someone before on some podcast somewhere.
Yeah. So I flew into Auckland and spent a day in Auckland, and then they shipped me down to the Waikato, and I spent a better part of a year down there, running around with the Mulu boys and, doing that stuff. That was back 1992 though. So,
wow. Okay. Yeah. That was
a long time ago.
Just a few years before I arrived.
Yeah. I think it was when, I don't know if you follow rugby there, but anyway, well, you are obviously, in New Zealand. I understand you're in Auckland. Is that correct?
Correct. Yeah.
Okay. And you've been I guess registered dietitian for, I'm reading your website, 25 plus years, looks like, something like that.
Yep, end of 95, and I've been in New Zealand since end of 95 from South Africa.
Oh, you're from South Africa. That's interesting. My mother's South African, so she was born in she was born in Benoni, South Africa, and so I used to go there a bunch when I was a kid too. So it's kind of interesting. It's kind of a small world. And you are, correct me if I'm not mistaken, you are a proponent of whole foods. You're a proponent of maybe a low carb, higher healthy fat approach, I guess is fair to say.
Yeah.
And you've been doing that.
Absolutely.
Have you worked with, I guess, is it Grant Schofield? Is he someone you've done some work with?
Oh, absolutely. We work together at the Human Potential Center at AUT in academia, and we've written several books together. So yeah, Grant and I go back a long way.
Gotcha. Okay. I love that. I have to talk to him one day as well. Well, let me just, I guess, tell us a little bit about your background that I already disclosed for us, if you don't mind.
Okay. So I guess I trained as a dietitian in South Africa, in Cape Town. And so that was an undergraduate degree in physiology, and then a postgrad in dietetics. And then end of 95, I shifted myself off to New Zealand, and I went to the winterless north, a place called Whangarei, and worked as a public health dietitian there for about 4 years, and then moved to Auckland in the year 2000 to AUT, Auckland University of Technology, and I guess I've been an academic there ever since. And throughout my career, I've been involved in clinical practice. So that's kind of, that's the shortened version of where I've come from and where I've landed, really.
Yeah. And I guess, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think it's fair to say probably the majority of people in the nutrition space, I know in the United States, probably the same in New Zealand, are probably not advocating for low carbohydrate diets. Is that fair to say in New Zealand, or what would you say?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. I mean, New Zealand really just echoes what's happening around the world. I mean, we have had a lot more traction over the last 4 or 5 years. Like a lot of the general practitioners, a lot more of the dietitians are heading in that direction. But it's fair to say there's still a little bit of opposition, I guess. I'll tell you a classic example. Our New Zealand dietitians kind of group, we're redoing the guidelines for type 2 diabetes. So that came around for consultation. And, I love when things come around for consultation because, if they ask for consultation and contribution, then they're going to get it. So, of course, a colleague of mine just went to town and provided all the necessary information, evidence about low carb and type 2 diabetes. And it was submitted to them, and about a month later it came back and the document had been sort of confirmed and updated, and there was not a whole lot that was added apart from a little link to low carb diets can be used to manage type 2 diabetes. Please see the link to the New Zealand diabetes site, and then you click the link and you go through to it. And it says, low carb diets aren't really recommended. So, a bit of a disaster all in all. But, in saying that, I think the national bodies are the last to change, but there are a lot more people on the ground that are changing and have changed over the last little while.
Yeah, I think that's fairly fair to say. I see that here. People are they're kind of just, not waiting for the science or the governing bodies to make those proclamations. They're taking it upon themselves to fix their own health. Why do you think, what drew you towards this sort of recommendation or this sort of, I guess for diabetes or maybe for other conditions? I've seen, personally, I'm this crazy guy telling people to eat a bunch of meat, and I'm seeing, I just see where diseases getting fixed, autoimmune diseases, diabetes, hypertension, all kinds of stuff, mental health stuff. What drew you towards that? Where were you at and what made you make the change? I assume you did change.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I was a loyal dietitian to the good old food pyramid and the food nutrition guidelines, and it was healthy whole grains, low fat. I mean, the whole thing. Up until about 9 or so years ago, and it's fair to say that even 5 or 10 years before that, when Atkins started to come out, do the rounds, I conveniently made it go away, which is kind of interesting, when you reflect on how you sort of poo-pooed certain ways of thinking. And I don't know if that's just a maturity thing or what. But yeah, it was the last sort of 9 years, and it really started from a couple of conversations that I had with my colleagues, and one of them was Professor Grant Schofield, who he was always kind of well ensconced in the physical activity, domain. That was his training, his background. And I would always have this kind of little protection of the patch when it came to nutrition, which is so ridiculous looking back. I mean, God, my world has just totally changed. But, I was the one who would be allowed to talk about nutrition. And if you weren't qualified with nutrition quals, you weren't really permitted to talk about nutrition. Anyway, we were having a conversation one day and he was talking to me. We were just getting into the area of insulin resistance, and we had a PhD student who was looking at hyperinsulinemia. And I was brought on board as a secondary supervisor for this PhD student just because I was like a healthy skeptic and I'd always provide the kind of the other side of the argument. Anyway, so he was saying to me, so type 2 diabetes is characterized by insulin resistance. We started talking about what that meant. And then he said, so dietary management of type 2 diabetes is what? I said, well, healthy whole grains, 45 to 60% of your diet is carbohydrates and blah, blah, blah. And he asked a very, very simple question. And he said, why? What is the reason why we manage a condition of insulin resistance with the very thing that our bodies struggle to process under the conditions of insulin resistance and hyperinsulinemia? And it just sort of stopped me in my tracks. No one had really asked me that before. And of course I was really defensive and said, there must be a good reason. It must be for all those, the fiber and the B vitamins and all that stuff that, people say you need from whole grains. So there must be a reason for it. And that kind of prompted me to do a really deep dive into the literature and revisiting some of the rationale for low carb and some of the physiology, biochemistry around it. And it just kind of blew me away. In fact, there was a time there, probably for about 3 or 4 months, that I thought, what am I going to do with this information? It's that whole cliche of once you see something, you can't unsee it. And I was in a real quandary. What do I do with my career? I think I actually need to get out of this because I just don't know how to handle this. And it kind of morphed from there. And then, Tim Noakes came on board with Banting, and it all kind of slowly moved to where I got to and where I am now, which is totally convinced that that is definitely the way forward for not only type 2 diabetes, but a range of conditions. And to be fair, I think for general health, being a proponent of whole food, if you really look at what whole food is and you really truly eat good definition of whole food, it's going to end up being lower in carbohydrate, higher in protein and fat anyway.
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, you might get a lot more fiber, but you're not getting much else, as far as that, but the macronutrients tend to be there. So when you said, you used to defend them, and, there's clearly it's still a counter argument. We should not be giving diabetics low carb diets, ketogenic diets, feeding them meat and eggs or whatever. What is the criticism? What is the argument? And then how do you sort of say that argument doesn't make sense? I mean, what is the rationale for saying what we're doing is bad?
Yeah, I mean, the few arguments that people use. The first one is the classic default is, well, carbohydrate is the main fuel of energy for the body, which, as we know, is not necessarily true. It is one of several fuels. So, that whole argument of carbohydrate being an essential nutrient and all that can be debunked with physiology quite nicely. So that falls down. The other argument is about micronutrients. So if you have a low carb diet, you're going to be devoid of fiber and micronutrient, and that is absolute nonsense. In fact, I've just recently published 2 papers with some colleagues in Australia looking at analyzing the micronutrient status of low carb diets for adults and also for children. Not keto diets, but low carb diet around sort of 60 to 80 grams of carbohydrates, which is still pretty low carb, about, maybe 20% of total energy. And interestingly, if a diet is well planned, and that is the kicker, if the diet is well planned and well organized, it can be rich in micronutrients and is often richer in fiber than a diet that follows kind of standard guidelines. So that whole micronutrient and fiber argument is a moot point. It's ridiculous. You've just got to understand food composition and know where you get your nutrients from for that to be sorted. The third one is a little bit more of a challenge, and as you know, there's a global kind of argument about the whole lipid thing, and having lots of saturated fat will raise your LDL, and that will result in heart disease. And that science has moved, but it hasn't quite moved to where it needs to move to get everyone on board. And I'm really glad that Dave Feldman's recent paper on lean mass hyperresponders and higher LDL cholesterol with low carb diets has been finally published in black and white for everyone to see. It's a hypothesis paper, but he's been talking about this for a long time, and it's really, really nice to see some of these arguments in black and white. So the whole kind of heart disease argument is what people talk about, and again, I often counter that with a counter argument for saturated fat, LDL, and heart disease. But also the fact that you don't have to do a low carb diet with very high levels of saturated fat at all. And if that's a problem for you, then you can get more of an even distribution of your monos, your polys, and your saturated fat. So we can still do a low carb diet for people who are skeptic about lipids and consequences of high saturated fat intake. So those, I think, are the three main arguments and subsequent counter arguments.
Yeah, I hear another argument from certainly from the plant-based advocates will say that insulin resistance actually is accumulation of lipids within the cells. These things interfere with the signaling molecules, and so you get this accumulated things like ceramides, and these are been shown to be caused by saturated fat in the blood, particularly things like palmitic acid. Have you looked into that? Is that? I mean, I know what my counter is to that, but I'm just wondering if you've heard that or have thought about that.
I have heard that, and I have seen that presented at conferences before, and it's always been a little bit of a quandary to me. And I think it's probably something I need to delve into a lot deeper, because I haven't. But I think even if there is an argument there is also a strong counter argument. So it's not like one argument should be pushed aside just because a counter argument is something that whatever group has taken forward. So I think there are a lot of physiological and biochemical pathways that might suggest something occurs, but in practice it actually doesn't occur. So how the physiology and the biochemistry plays out is important to look at as well. So there are so many people who get such amazing results, and with low carb diets, with well formulated low carb diets that are rich in micronutrients and whatever, and the diabetes is reversed and the insulin resistance is reversed or kept at bay. That how can that counter argument be the argument that stands? I don't know. I question that.
Yeah, well, I think there's, obviously there's many, many physiologic things going on, and just because something's a fact doesn't mean it's the overall picture. But interestingly, and I talked to Ben Bickman, who is one of the scientists who actually showed that saturated fat in blood did lead to the accumulation of ceramides. But what he later realized is the saturated fat in the blood was not necessarily a product of what you ingested. It was mostly through de novo lipogenesis. Mm-hmm. And that, in fact, Jeff Olick's study from a few years earlier showed that dietary saturated fat had almost no bearing on serum saturated fat. In fact, it was actually shown it was lower. So it was kind of one of those things where it's probably just excess caloric intake that's driving de novo lipogenesis, which is then leading to this insulin resistance, which I think is probably closer to the truth, although who knows? All this stuff is very challenging.
I think you're right. And I think those two studies were key. One was the Cassandra Forsyth, Jeff Olick study, where he found exactly that. The low carb or the keto group had a much greater reduction in overall saturated fatty acids compared to the standard group. But the other one that was really interesting was when they titrated carbohydrate and decreased fat. They basically dropped the carbohydrate after a few weeks and raised the fat and then reversed it. And found substantial outcomes there with regards to de novo lipogenesis. So I think that is really, really underestimated. And I also think that something which is not really fleshed out in the science, which could be better done, is what is the context? Is the context calorie excess? Is the context calorie maintenance or calorie deficit? And I think the physiological consequences under each of those different conditions are quite different and need to be placed in context.
Yeah, and I think that's echoed. You see studies on saturated fat leading to fatty liver disease. You also see fructose leading to fatty liver disease, but both of these are in a caloric surplus. And I know from my perspective, I eat a lot of saturated fat. I'm really in a caloric surplus because I'm too damn full. It's kind of like there's kind of this natural feedback mechanism that kind of limits that, kind of governs that thing. So I do think these experimental conditions are not always replicated in real life. And I think that's another, which makes it so hard to do because it's hard to tell what's going on in real life. You see in New Zealand, I'm seeing, maybe you've seen some of this. I'm sure you have. I have. Carbon neutrality, we're going to limit the production of, because they have such great lamb in New Zealand. Gosh, there's 60 million sheep or something, 100 million sheep. I don't know how many you have down there. I know there's like 20 for every person. There was a sheep in New Zealand I would have. lamb and roast kumara was the dish they would always feed me. It seemed like I got that every time I went to someone's house. But are you seeing continued pushes to eliminate, reduce meat, dairy, things like that from the New Zealand diet? Right?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. It's obviously a hot topic at the moment, and New Zealand's a little pimple on the world's buttocks, really, and we are doing everything that we need to do to reduce the carbon footprint to the point that or to the level that potentially this might affect our economy, it might affect our farmers, all sorts of things, and I just think we need to be very careful about what we contribute to and how we contribute to this whole climate change kind of argument. And, there's been move to change resources to teach kids in schools to decrease meat intake and dairy intake because of this. And of course, kids often, what they read and they hear and then what they do are not always synonymous. So they might read, we need to eat a little bit less meat and a little bit less dairy, and they interpret it as, oh, we need to be vegan. So, reducing a little bit becomes elimination. And I think we're going to have dire consequences with micronutrient deficiencies over time because of this move. We are very lucky in New Zealand that our cows are grass fed, and we get the benefit from that. But we also need to get a little bit more savvy about regenerative agriculture and moving into more holistic ways of farming. So we can sort of improve the carbon footprint and the health of the soil and, all that kind of stuff. And we've actually got Diana Rogers coming to New Zealand next month to do some promotion of her new movie. And it's all about this. So I think that's going to be really good. We're going to try and get a lot of Kiwis, we'll try to get some high up Kiwis to come and watch the movie and participate in the debate and conversation. Because I think, every action has a reaction, and every action has a reaction. And I think the action of, reducing the importance of dairy and of meat from a climate change perspective, as I said, the reaction is not going to be great when it comes to overall health long term.
Yeah, and New Zealand is well suited for animal agriculture. I mean, it's very pastoral. I mean, I live there. It's just beautiful, beautiful grazing areas, and you've got that wonderful resource. And and I know Diana, and I've seen her movie and read her book and interviewed her many times and met her in person several times. It's almost kind of I would call it almost virtue signaling, because you're not really doing much. I mean, when you look at the overall global scheme, I mean, even in the United States, if all of us turned into vegans, the impact on the climate perspective would be less than 1%. And greenhouse gases is this tiny. In New Zealand, a fraction of our population would be a fraction of a fraction of a fraction of that. Let me ask you about maybe a little bit about the indigenous population. So obviously I said kia ora, which is the Maori way to say hello, but do the Maoris, I mean, probably like our indigenous population, Native Americans and, there's some Alaskans and other places in the world, are they suffering from metabolic disease in a disproportionate rate? And do you know what their traditional diets would look like? I've seen stuff about the Aboriginals, but I'm not sure about the Maori.
So we have Maori and Pacific Island populations that are indigenous to, the Maori population is indigenous, and, Pacific Island populations came over, obviously from the islands. And as you say, like any indigenous group, they are highly represented in poor health in our country. And there's several things going on there. If you look at the traditional diets, firstly, if you look at the traditional diets for the Pacific Islanders, we're talking fish, we're talking fruits, we're talking coconut, we're talking whole food. And there is a study, I can't recall, I think it was in the 80s, and it was done looking at analyzing the cholesterol levels of the Pacific Islanders in relation to their diet. And they found that based on what they eat, they had high levels of cholesterol, but they did not have any traces of actual disease. And that's kind of interesting. They had a diet which was high in coconut milk, coconut water, fish, all those things. And it's a real shame that we can't get those cultures to go back to their traditional foods. Because if you actually go to the islands now, what you'll see is soft drinks, chips. It's the Western influence, and that is a real shame because it's turned a people with some really good eating habits into the rest of us. So that's a real shame. And typically when the islanders have come to New Zealand, the desire to have fast foods and convenient foods are all right there, and they are positioned or situated right by the local in the local communities. So if you go into South Auckland, for example, we've got a high proportion of Maori and Pacific Islanders. There is a fast food outlet on every single street corner. Kids can't walk to school without going past somewhere that they're going to buy fast food and very cheap fizzy drinks and things like that. So that's the islanders. When you look at the Maori, the traditional diets, when you look at the hangi, which is really when you dig a big pit in the ground and you lay stones. It's like an underground barbecue, really, and you put meat in there and you put vegetables in there. End of story. And that was the traditional dish that was had, or traditional meal that was had with family or whānau. At all the traditional events and celebrations and things. And again, if they could try and integrate some of their old cultural eating practices into today, they'd be much better off. So their health is really poor because they're eating like Westerners. They've got access to cheap, nutrient poor, ultra processed foods. And I think one of the biggest problems really is the fact that these groups don't trust the Western system for healthcare. So that's the biggest problem. So I had a conversation with some of the dietitians in one of the biggest hospitals in South Auckland called Middlemore about the diabetes service. And, there would be a slim, 20-year-old white female sitting there, and she'd say, well, yeah, I'm in the diabetes service, and Samoan man, overweight man comes in, and he talks to me. I talk to him about his diabetes, and I tell him he needs to eat this, that, and the other, and he goes away and he doesn't come back. Well, what a surprise, so that rapport building and that trust is not able to be built. The Indigenous people don't trust the white people for a whole host of reasons, relating to colonization and whatever. So the system is broken. The way that we talk about health to Maori and Pacific Island are not in ways that they understand health. And there is move to this movement in our health system. We are going to be having a Māori Health Authority. And I think, I really hope that's going to be one step in the right direction to at least speak the same language to the people that need the help. So, so it's one, that they're eating the wrong foods. But number two, when we try and help them, it doesn't work because the system doesn't allow for that connection to be made. Yeah.
Yeah. I guess, but they're happy to eat the food. The Western food they're okay to eat with, but they don't want the Western medicine, which, is kind of an interesting thing. I remember there was an interesting paper I'd share with you on Michael Richard, who's done a lot of radioisotope data. And he did some studies on the Pacific Island. I think it might have been Fiji. And they looked at old records, old ancestral, anthropology records. And they found that based on radioisotope data, what they were finding is they were actually catching fish and feeding them to pigs to fatten up, to feed the pigs. And then the pigs they fed the humans with. So I know there's some pigs running around in New Zealand, and, those are things that, again, pigs are high in, they've got quite a bit of monounsaturated fat. This is the interesting thing that most people don't realize. It beef is predominantly monounsaturated fat, with saturated fat coming in as a close second. And so it's kind of actually quite a mixed food. It just doesn't have much polyunsaturated fat. What, as far as, you mentioned some of these other conditions, I mean, the diabetes stuff, it just makes sense. I mean, a lot of people, it physiologically makes sense to them. If I'm carbohydrates make my blood glucose go way up high, maybe if I don't eat them, then I'm not going to have high blood sugar, and that's a good thing. But really, diabetes is probably more complicated than that in my view. But some of these other conditions, are you seeing, like I'm seeing, mental health things, mental health? What about mental health and diet? Does that have a role, do you think?
Oh gosh, that's the next big thing, which has been brewing for a long time. And gosh, our mental health crisis is just an absolute boom at the moment. And you could say, why do we have a mental health crisis caused by all sorts of things? But I definitely think that nutrition and our food industry and our food environment has a role to play. And I don't want to say a small role or a large role to play, but it has a role to play in the development, I think, in poor mental health, but also it could have a role to play in improving mental health. And I think that really comes from our move from whole foods to ultra processed foods. I think our micronutrient status has just dropped substantially. And I think that's as a result of it not being present in ultra-processed food, but it also might be because of our soils and because of what we put in our soils and what we don't put in our soils, and the time it takes for the nutrients to go from the soil to the plant, related to the speed at which we grow plants. Like, there's just a whole lot of these things that are going on. And there have been some really, really good studies that have been done in New Zealand by Professor Julia Rutledge, who's a professor of psychiatry down in Canterbury University, and she investigates high-dose micronutrients for various mental health disorders, ranging from ADHD right through to trauma conditions. And she's well published in this area, and she's really finding that high-dose micronutrients, and we're not talking about something, some micronutrients, some special high fandangled nutrient that you've never heard of. We're just talking about standard vitamins and minerals that you get in food, but high doses of them. She's finding really, really good efficacy compared to placebo in terms of treating various mental health states in both adults and in children. And the interesting thing is, when you look at, not that I want to discredit antidepressant medication, but they are fraught with issues. But if you look at a month's supply for a standard antidepressant medication, say for a teenager who's struggling, you'd pay $5 a month, $5 New Zealand dollars a month. I mean, that is nothing. And if you look at these nutrients that Professor Rutledge is using, if you extrapolate that out, it comes to about $300 per month. If you want to use the strength and that's needed to create the outcome. So it's not government funded, and people are strapped for cash, finances, financial burdens and things. Who's going to choose $300 a month over $5 a month? So that it's another part of the problem, I think, is when it comes to treatment of mental health issues and accessibility to good quality medication or food-related medication. In other words, supplementation. Yeah.
You mentioned these, common everyday micronutrients. I can rattle off a bunch of vitamins and stuff like. But are there any that are specifically common that you see? Do you test for that in clients you work with? Are you able to see those things in real time?
No, I don't. I don't do any testing. I think micronutrient testing is fraught again with problems. And what people eat and what's going on in internally are not necessarily related. I definitely think that's an area that needs more work, is how to optimally test for micronutrients in a way that's going to be functionally meaningful. But if you look at if you look at, say, serotonin, which is your major neurotransmitter that controls mood and sleep and gut health and all sorts of things, for 5-hydroxy tryptophan to be converted into serotonin, the demands are include micronutrients like vitamin B6, zinc, magnesium. Off the top of my, those are the three that come to mind. Iron, a few others there, and you could imagine that during a mental health crisis, the metabolic turnover in the body from anxiety-related conditions and status really enhances the uptake of the micronutrients. And if there's not enough being delivered via the food, and you've got this higher demand, well, then you've got a mismatch. So, it's a real problem. So there's a deficiency to begin with, probably. And then because of the higher demand, it widens the gap, and then the conditions are certainly not going to get better and potentially would get worse. And again, it's not only a nutrition thing, but of course, everything else around it, stress, anxiety, poor gut health. The gut and the brain are so intricately, bidirectionally related. And then, of course, the pressures of modern life and social media and all those things collectively, it's just like a perfect storm of just being unhealthy. It's a real problem.
Yeah, we see it, and I don't see it getting better. It seems like as we push to this, the dietary plan for health, it seems like it's pushing more towards a processed food diet, and we see these, alternate protein meat analogs that are coming out many of them are ultra processed food that doesn't seem to serve the function that you'd want it to, which would be to provide healthy food to people. Do you, as far as the New Zealand diet, I assume right now it's pretty much similar to the American diet, would be my guess. Mostly carbs, mostly processed, ultra processed food. It's interesting. I think I read, if I'm not mistaken, I think New Zealand and the U.S. are the only two countries in the world that allow drug manufacturers to advertise directly on TV. Is that something? Is that something you guys see on the television, like pharmaceutical manufacturers on TV?
We don't see a lot of that. We see a little bit of it, but we don't see a lot of it in New Zealand. But just to reiterate, we are definitely just a small version of what's going on in the rest of the world. Like if you take any New Zealander and you put them in the States, for example, they'd go like, wow, this is just, portion size of poor quality food in New Zealand relates to about quadruple portion size, the same poor quality food in the US. So we're seeing a very, very similar situation there. And we do see a push of pharmaceuticals. It's just the way. And it is, traditionally the doctor's role is to see a patient for 15 minutes. I mean, like, honestly, what can you do in 15 minutes? Like, seriously, I just don't understand what you can do in 15 minutes, I guess, apart from write out a prescription for something without asking more than 2 questions. So, again, the system is broken. So I feel really, really sorry for GPs who are pushed pharmaceuticals by the pharmaceutical industry. And, this is used to patch that up. This is used to patch that up. And it's like, well, in 15 minutes, you can't talk to them about their diet and their lifestyle. So you can hardly blame them in a way. And I know a lot of general practitioners in New Zealand and in Australia are actually changing the way that they work, and they're offering longer appointments. Of course, you have to pay for them, but lengthier appointments where they're discussing prevention, they're discussing diet and lifestyle management in conjunction with pharmaceutical intervention, with the idea that there's some sort of deprescribing strategy involved when health improves, or as health improves.
Yeah, I think that 15-minute thing is almost by design. It seems like, as you can't do much. And I remember as an orthopedic surgeon, when I had a very simple, post-op check or say, it was always a relief. It was like, and if you think about it, and if all you got to do is reflexively look at a lab and prescribe a prescription, and they're seemingly happy. You've got less work to do, makes your day go easier. And I see, whereas, if you have to get into lifestyle and the psychology and the diet, that's more exhausting for a person. You don't want to do that. You just not mentally prepared to do that all day long for a lot of people. We just, hopefully done with this stuff, went through this 2 years of pandemic stuff. In the United States, there was no mention of improving health. I mean, zero. It was all 100% pharmaceutical solution. Did you see any mention of that in New Zealand? I saw from remote, what was going on, I don't know. Was there a push to say, hey guys, this would be a good time to perhaps work on your health, work on your overall health, maybe lose some weight, stop eating garbage? Was that messaging ever done?
In a word, no. So it's really interesting because at the start of the pandemic, every single day, at midday, the Prime Minister and Minister of Health would address the country about how many cases and how many in hospital and how many in ICU, and it was like 3 cases today. It was very, very small scale compared to the rest of the world. And then we went into, various lockdown strategies. But every single day, in the middle of the day, the whole country turned on their TV. I mean, this is remarkable. Like, I never in my history have I known the entire country to switch on the TV in the middle of the day to see what was going on. So a truly captive audience. And throughout the whole pandemic, there was not one mention of anything else apart from social distancing, counts of cases and with COVID in hospital. And then, of course, the big vaccination push. So it was, adverts and everything, all about vaccination. Not once was there any mention of anything. And I think, there was a real missed opportunity. They had the whole country listening and watching them. A simple message could have gone a long way. Every day they could have said, get outside for, 15-minute walk, or shop the walls of the supermarket, or make sure you look after, eat more fruit and vegetables, look after your metabolic health. I mean, we say this all the time, but no one really listens to us unless it's one-to-one and people are paying us, right? But if you have the Prime Minister, which, a part of the country really looks up to, sending a subtle message every single day, I think that could have gone a long way. But no mention, nothing about metabolic health, which was, I think it was just criminal, to be honest. And it was interesting that, like, there were these adverts, and they had this little jingle, and they had this little kind of yellow and black kind of banner that's, COVID-19, whatever. And I did a little Facebook page on my social media, and I did this post, and I created this little yellow and black kind of logo thing, COVID-19 alert, and I put a few comments about how to look after your metabolic health, like eat less of this, eat more of this, and do more of that. Like 3 or 4 very simple messages. And most of the comments were, but I did get slammed by a couple of people who said, we've got more things to worry about here. We need to eat biscuits for comfort, and we need to do this, and we can't be concerned about, healthy eating and vegetables when, this is of utmost importance. And I thought to myself, I think there's some people who don't really get that the two are totally related. Like, you can't just go, I'll just put my health to one side here and, think about this pandemic. It's all related. Health is the number one. And there's been some really good evidence to show that if you've got good metabolic health, or if you've got very poor metabolic health, your outcomes from some of these things, particularly what we've got at the moment, not so flash.
Yeah,
a real missed opportunity.
Yeah, and everybody I've talked to, frontline physicians, had said, pretty much almost with rare exception, the people they took care of were metabolically compromised people, obese people, or very elderly, which, is always a situation. And it doesn't matter if it's COVID-19 or the flu or really anything, cancer, heart disease. It all seems to strike the same cohort. Yeah. And we could have done that, I think, with very little effort. I mean, we'd already had the infrastructure built in we had the captive audience. You couldn't walk down a street and not get messaging about, what you're supposed to do. And so it was there. And so it could have been very easy to add that on. Where do you, as far as, let me get your thoughts on protein, because that's a, I guess, a controversial topic. There are people out there telling you that protein is awful and we should eat the very bare minimum because it's going to cause us to expire early, like a fruit fly or a nematode, or it's going to give us cancer. And if there's other people that say, hey, look, you need protein for lean mass. Where do you fall on that spectrum?
Yeah, I think protein has really been the underestimated macronutrient of the three of them in general circles. I think in weight training, bodybuilding circles, it's a different story. But for population health, I think protein has been kind of pushed aside because we always talk about high carb, low fat, low carb, high fat. But where's the protein in this? And I think when keto first came, well, not first, but when it sort of got modernized over the last sort of 10, 15 years, there was this, well, to get into nutritional ketosis, you have to have your protein quite low as well. So again, that was like let's drive the protein down for this, for this reason that everyone in the world has to get into nutritional ketosis rather than certain population groups for certain, chronic conditions and effects. But, everyone had to be in ketosis all the time, and therefore protein had to come down. And we know a lot more about that. We know that protein doesn't need to be so low, even if you want to get into nutritional ketosis. But I think that we've been done a disservice by that recommended daily intake, RDI or RDA, recommended daily allowance of 0.8 grams of protein per kilogram body mass, and ridiculously low. And I think as a result, protein is not the focus. And when you look at particularly females over the age of, say, 40, and they approaching, getting to perimenopause, approaching menopause, and muscle mass retention is a big issue. And of course, we know one of the biggest contributors to death in the elderly is falls. And I think having optimal muscle mass and optimal balance will help prevent that. So I think protein needs to be put on the map a little bit more, and I think it is. Maybe not in a public health sense, but certainly in the people that I work with and I follow and everything are kind of getting that protein should be a priority. And I think good quality protein should be a priority as well. It's not about, let me just throw a few extra protein bars in my day. It's good quality protein so that we can get all the micronutrients that we need. And, the whole kind of animal versus plant thing is particularly interesting with this whole kind of protein thing. And if you look at some of the vegan products on the market that are, they have been generated and packaged so that they've got reasonable amounts of protein, but they've also got plenty of other additives and all sorts of things in them. So they're just becoming a higher protein processed food. So I think there's a quantity thing that is really important, and we need to pay attention to higher levels of protein than we are currently used to. But I think there's a quality thing that we need to pay attention to as well. So, yeah, those are my two thoughts there.
Every 5 years we come up with some dietary guidelines in the United States, which a lot of the world, parrots. I think probably New Zealand being one of them most likely. And do you see any problems with them? I think currently, it's recommended, I think certainly less than 10%, maybe down to 7% of saturated fat in the diet, and the relatively low protein requirements. Do you have any major criticisms of the sort of New Zealand standard diet plate? I don't know what it is, whatever you guys call it there.
You mean our national guidelines?
Yes, sure.
Nutrition guidelines?
Yeah.
Oh, yeah, for sure. It's the same as the rest of the world. Like our saturated fat recommendation is under 10% of total energy. I mean, firstly, who walks around with a mental calculator in the supermarket knowing what less than 10% of total energy is in saturated fat? I mean, people, half of my students can't even calculate that, and they're studying a sport and recreation degree. So it's kind of ridiculous. And, just to illustrate that point, when myself and my Australian colleagues were doing this work looking at analyzing the nutrient reference values in hypothetical low carb diets, we found that once we'd gone low fat, lean meat, low fat dairy, olive oil instead of butter or coconut oil. So it was like really low typical saturated fat holding foods in the diet plan, and we analyzed it. We found that we were still like 12 or 13% saturated fat of total energy. So we're still 2 or 3% over our standard guidelines. And what we wanted to do for this paper was analyze it, just how it was going to be analyzed, and then analyze it according to under 10% total saturated fat. And the only way that we could manipulate the diet to get it under 10% saturated fat was to remove the avocado, to drop the olive oil, or to increase the amount of alcohol in the diet. I mean, it just sounds absolutely absurd. So I think, having a general guideline, the way it plays out, can often just be really, really absurd. So saturated fat guideline, I think definitely needs to be revisited.
Yeah, I was going to say, if you're struggling as a 25 plus year dietitian to construct the diet that meets that criteria, the average person is going to be clueless. And then I'd wonder if you actually did successfully do that, where you would have other deficiencies. Probably some other deficiencies show up by doing that. Is that fair to say?
Yeah, it does. And I think when you are looking at micronutrient status of hypothetical diet, it's really interesting. You can't just slap one together. You've really got to play around quite a lot. If you add a bit more of that, then protein might or carb might go down, but then protein goes up, and then that goes over the guidelines. And then if you have salmon for the day instead of meat, then your total iron might be a little bit below the RDI for that day. Is it meaningful long term? Well, probably not if you're having a wide variety of animal-based foods with lots of iron and zinc and things. So it is, I think that the recommended daily intake, I know we need guidelines, or maybe we don't, I don't know, but recommended daily intakes are just fraught with problems. And I think what would be quite useful to do, I'd love to do the study, if I can only just get some money to do it, is to look at a whole bunch of people, low carb diets, standard, national guideline, following people follow national guideline diets, and look at micronutrient status in these diets, and then look at blood levels of these micronutrients. And I think you'll find some really interesting things. And I think you'll find that people who are meant to be eating according to standard guidelines fall way short of a lot of these micronutrients. So, people point fingers to low carb and other types of diets. But when you look at the standard diet, is everyone doing it beautifully, optimally? No, I don't think so. I think there are lots and lots of flaws there. So yeah, love to do that study one day. Interestingly enough, and where we've come into a lot of issues is when you are, again, manipulating a diet and you drop the carbs to, whatever, say 20% or, under 100 grams a day, because the energy requirements for some people, depending who you're working with, are quite high. You've got fat and protein to sort of play off against each other. And often the protein ends up being quite high compared to what the guidelines say. So the guidelines will say between 15 and 25% of total energy. That's our guideline anyway. And you might get to 26%, but then you might get to like 2.7 grams per kilogram, where, that's like 3 times what the RDI is. So you've got to then in your paper justify why your protein is supposedly so high. I mean, I don't think it's particularly high, because there are no detrimental effects at that level. But then, of course, reviewers come on and they go, oh, kidney issues and all sorts of things, and your protein's too high and that's too dangerous. And it's like, oh my goodness, it's exhausting. Trying to manipulate a diet to satisfy everything, carb, protein, fat, and micronutrients. It can't be done.
Yeah, I think, and just disclosure, I eat a lot of protein. My diet is probably 35% protein on average, and sometimes a little higher depending, and no ill effects, just to put that out there. It's interesting because you said, maybe we shouldn't have not dietary guidelines. And that's an interesting thought, because I think places, if I'm not, and you may know better than I do, I think Brazil came out with their national guidelines. It was basically just cook food at home, eat whole foods. And that was the gist of their dietary guidelines. I think that, quite honestly, would probably be as good as any other recommendation. I mean, let's say they put you in charge of the health service and you got to make the dietary guidelines. How would you describe it? What would you do?
No, I love it. It was actually quite funny because myself and Grant Schofield actually sat in my office about 8 years ago and picked up a pen and wrote some guidelines on the whiteboard. It's like, right, those are the real food guidelines. And it was something like eat whole food or eat foods that were once alive. Make sure you can recognize your foods. Eat with your community, and I can't actually do lots of physical activity. It's not really a nutrition guideline, but it was more like a lifestyle guideline. Drink more water, and don't eat while you are watching TV or driving or whatever. So again, I think you're spot on. The Brazil guidelines are brilliant because they don't nitpick about, keep your saturated fat intake under 10%. It's like, well, who can do that anyway? It's about behaviors, and it's about being more mindful of what you eat, where you eat, when you eat, and how you eat. And I think, in the context around eating a main meal with your family, or I think they've got a guideline like don't eat when you're going through the shopping mall or something like that. And I think the eating habits and eating behaviors would be a much better way to go. Like I said, we tried to do this about 8 years ago on the whiteboard. I'd love to have an opportunity to do it again and influence the health reform. But influencing the guidelines, sometimes it's more satisfying to bash your head against a brick wall. You can try and you put submissions in, and you just get nowhere. I mean, we don't stop doing it, but it doesn't give you that kind of job satisfaction that I would get in my clinic or in my other office.
Yeah, I mean, I guess what was I going to say? I mean, you may not get the reference, but some people that are Chicago Cubs fan up until recently, they always lose. They keep losing. They never make it there. But I mean, because I see people like Nina Teicholz, who's, I mean, bless her, she's doing, just a tremendous job trying to convince these guidelines people. Every year she goes back and she's like, they didn't listen. They don't want to listen to the science. And, the skeptical, cynical side of me says, they probably have an agenda that has a lot of conflict of interest involved in that. And so it's kind of frustrating in that regard. But I think we do have an opportunity on a sort of grassroots level to impact a lot of people. I know that social media has given us some of that, which has been kind of interesting. Caryn, I don't want to leave.
But look at the. Oh, sorry. I just wanted to say, look at the guidelines. Look at the diabetes guidelines. The American Diabetes Association have changed. They've adopted low carb guidelines, and that is echoed throughout other countries around the world. So I don't think we should give up. It's not in vain. It's just frustrating. Yeah. It's not in vain. It will happen.
Well, and it's interesting because, as you probably know, the past president of the American Diabetes Association was a type 2 diabetic using low carb diets to prove it. So you've got somebody with some buy-in. And I think, hopefully, I mean, not everybody's an evil James Bond villain. I mean, there's some people up there in places of authority that suffer from these things. I mean, it's so ubiquitous. I mean, everybody's got chronic disease, or at least someone in their family does. And so it strikes close to home. And when you can start demonstrating, this is where, and just, I guess, there's a lot of people that will say that, low carbs are no better than any other diet. Anything that makes you lose weight, anything that, is calorically equated with, you match protein, and low carb has no improvement whatsoever over anything else. How do you, I mean, what would cause you to say preference? Why is low carb better than just, it's a caloric reduction tool?
Yeah, look, I think, with weight loss, you can you only have to look at the US database to see that to lose weight and keep it off long term, you can do it in a multiple of ways. You can do high carb, low carb, you can do fasting, you can do shakes, you can eat just green food, you can do all sorts of things, as long as you are prepared to not stop what you're doing long term. So if you have that drive and that ability to adhere to whatever you're doing, then you can achieve weight loss. End of story. It's a calorie game. I think where low carb comes into its own is that for people with insulin resistance and who struggle to process their carbohydrate, weight loss becomes a pleasant byproduct of all these other, beneficial outcomes like stable blood sugar, better sleep, better mood, generally feeling a better sense of calm, which is typically related to more stable blood sugars. So, and I also don't think it needs, you need to necessarily do no carb or very low carb to achieve the outcomes that you want. So I certainly think keto would I probably do keto with about 5 or 10% of my clients, those with neurological conditions, concussion, migraine, epilepsy, certain, brain cancers and Parkinson's and things like that, potentially for athletes at certain times, for sure. But I try and sit in the low carb space for people in general, for people with type 2 diabetes or even type 1 diabetes. I try go as low as they want to go for it to be sustainable. I'd rather them sit a little bit higher on the carb spectrum, but do it longer term rather than go hardcore for a month and then go, oh my God, I can't do this again. It's too restrictive. And then people who don't have any chronic conditions like me at the moment that I know of, and other clients that I work with that just want to optimize their general health, they could sit a little bit higher on the carb spectrum, but again, it's looking at good quality carbs. So I would probably go, moderately low carb, moderate protein, and sort of moderate-ish fat, because I think that you get benefit from all the macronutrients. I think we keep on playing one off against the other. So, sorry, I'm digressing. Just getting back to your question, what do I think it is about low carb? I think, I think that for people with insulin resistance and chronic conditions, there is a definite benefit over and above not doing low carb. With regards to outcomes.
Yeah, fair enough. And there's a lot of studies that support that as well. Caryn, I don't want to take too much of your time. I don't know what time it is in New Zealand. It's not, it's early in the morning, I think, or something like that, or mid-morning, I'm guessing, something like that. But
yep, anyway, 10 o'clock in the morning.
10 o'clock.
Nice and decent time.
Perfect time. Well, thank you for doing this. And can you tell folks where to find you? If you got some social media or any kind of websites or anything like that you want to share?
Yep. Yes, I've got. I'm a little bit old school, so I've just got. I've got a webpage, CarynZinn.com. I've got Twitter at Caryn Zinn, and my Facebook page is Caryn Zinn Dietitian. I don't do Instagram. I just can't keep up with all that needs to be done. So that's where you can find me. And I do want to say. Thank you to you, Shawn, for the invite and the opportunity to have a bit of a chit chat about all sorts of interesting things.
Yeah, thank you. It's been a pleasure. And do you do online consultations with people? Is that something part of your practice?
Yeah, absolutely. The interesting thing is, when the pandemic started, everyone, discovered Zoom. Well, I was Zooming way before the pandemic because I've had clients all around the world for a long time. So I've actually canceled my office subscription just because everyone wants to be online. So yeah, online consults available.
All right, very good. Well, thank you, Caryn, and thanks for us, you guys, for tuning in. Take care, and look forward to chatting with you down the road sometime. Maybe meet you in person sometime if I get in that Southern Hemisphere again sometime.
You should come back to Cambridge. Look forward to it.
I would love to someday. So that maybe in the next couple of years. Anyway. All right, guys. Awesome. Thanks, everybody.
Thanks very much.
Bye-bye, y'all.